Welcome to the shadowy realm where medieval alchemy danced between salvation and damnation, where learned men toiled in secret chambers pursuing forbidden knowledge that could either transform base metals into gold or condemn their very souls to eternal torment. Before we venture into these dark corners of history, I'm curious to know where you're joining me from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Whether you're settling in for the evening in Prague or greeting the dawn in Tokyo, I'm grateful to have you here for this journey into one of history's most misunderstood arts. If you find yourself drawn to these explorations of humanity's darker chapters, that subscribe button awaits your touch, ensuring you never miss our descents into the forgotten realms of the past. Now, dim the lights and let your mind wander with me to a time when the boundary between science and sorcery was razor thin, and a single misstep could mean the difference between enlightenment and the executioner's block. The medieval world was a place of profound contradictions, where the light of knowledge flickered precariously against the overwhelming darkness of ignorance and superstition. In this twilight realm, alchemy emerged not merely as a primitive precursor to chemistry, but as something far more dangerous and seductive. It was a forbidden art that promised to unlock the very secrets of creation itself, to transmute not only metals, but the human soul. Picture, if you will, a stone chamber hidden beneath the foundations of a monastery. The air hangs thick with the acrid smoke of sulfur and mercury, while strange symbols cover every surface, their meanings known only to the initiated. Here, by the guttering light of candles, a hooded figure hunches over bubbling retorts and glowing furnaces, seeking to accomplish what God himself had done in the act of creation. This was the alchemist's domain, a place where the sacred and the profane merged into something altogether more sinister. To understand the true darkness that lurked within medieval alchemy, we must first grasp how deeply it was intertwined with the spiritual and political fabric of its time. The Catholic Church, that towering institution which dominated every aspect of medieval life, viewed alchemy with a mixture of fascination and terror. On one hand, many churchmen were themselves practitioners, seeing in the art a way to understand God's creation more intimately. On the other, the church hierarchy recognized the inherent danger in allowing common men to believe they could manipulate the fundamental forces of existence. The very foundations of alchemical practice rested upon a worldview that was both profoundly Christian and subtly heretical. Alchemists believed that all matter possessed a spiritual essence, that the physical and metaphysical worlds were inextricably linked. This wasn't merely about turning lead into gold, though that remained the most famous and coveted goal. It was about achieving what they called the great work, the magnum opus, a process that would culminate in the creation of the philosopher's stone, a substance that could not only transmute base metals, but grant eternal life and perfect wisdom. But herein lay the first seeds of darkness. In claiming they could create such a stone, alchemists were essentially claiming they could replicate or even surpass divine power. They sought to become like gods themselves, masters of life and death, creators of perfection in an imperfect world. The hubris inherent in such claims did not go unnoticed by church authorities, who began to see in alchemy not just a natural philosophy, but a challenge to the very order that God had established. The language of alchemy was deliberately obscure, shrouded in symbols and metaphors that served both to protect its secrets and to hide its practitioners from persecution. Mercury, sulfur, and salt became the three philosophical principles, representing spirit, soul, and body, respectively. The union of the Red King and White Queen symbolized the marriage of opposites necessary for transmutation. Dragons devouring their own tails represented the cyclical nature of the alchemical process. But beneath these seemingly innocent symbols lay darker implications. Consider the concept of the nigredo, the blackening, the first stage of the alchemical process. This wasn't merely a chemical operation, but a spiritual one, representing the death and putrefaction necessary before rebirth could occur. Alchemists spoke of killing the king, of dissolving the perfect into its constituent chaos before it could be reborn in a higher form. The imagery was violent, disturbing, and to many minds, blasphemous. How could good Christians speak so casually of death and dissolution, even in metaphorical terms? The practitioners themselves were often men who lived on the margins of society, scholars who had perhaps delved too deeply into forbidden texts, physicians who had grown dissatisfied with the limitations of conventional medicine, or simply desperate souls seeking the wealth that successful transmutation would bring. They gathered in secret societies, bound together by oaths of secrecy and shared pursuit of knowledge that the world deemed dangerous. One of the most notorious figures in medieval alchemy was the mysterious Geber, whose true identity remains shrouded in controversy. Some claim he was the 8th century Islamic scholar Jabir ibn Hayyan, while others believe Geber was a pseudonym used by various European alchemists. Regardless of his true identity, the works attributed to Geber were filled with processes that seemed to border on the demonic. He wrote of creating artificial life, of substances that could eat through any material, of powders that could kill with the slightest touch. The pursuit of the philosopher's stone led many alchemists down increasingly dark paths. Some began to experiment with human subjects, believing that the same principles that could transmute metals could also transform the human body and soul. There were whispered rumors of alchemists who attempted to create homunculi, artificial humans grown in glass vessels, fed on blood and other unspeakable substances. These creatures, if they existed at all, were said to possess knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, but at a cost that no righteous person should pay. The economic implications of alchemy were equally disturbing. If someone could truly transmute base metals into gold, they could destabilize entire kingdoms overnight. The careful balance of power that existed between monarchs, merchants, and the church depended upon the scarcity and intrinsic value of precious metals. A successful alchemist could, in theory, destroy this balance, flooding the market with gold and rendering the currency worthless. It's no wonder that many rulers viewed alchemists with suspicion, even as they secretly funded their research in hopes of gaining an advantage over their rivals. The workshop of a medieval alchemist was a place that would have seemed like a vision of hell to most contemporary observers. The air reeked of chemicals and burning substances, creating an atmosphere that was both literally and figuratively toxic. Strange apparatus filled every corner, vessels with serpentine tubes connecting them in configurations that seemed designed more for summoning demons than conducting natural philosophy. The walls were often covered with charts showing the correspondences between planets, metals, and bodily organs, reflecting the alchemical belief that the microcosm of human existence mirrored the macrocosm of the universe. In these chambers, alchemists performed operations that had names borrowed from torture and execution. They spoke of calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, putrefaction, coagulation, cibation, sublimation, fermentation, exaltation, multiplication, and projection. Each stage required specific conditions, precise timing, and often dangerous substances. Mercury, that quicksilver metal that seemed to exist between liquid and solid states, was particularly prized and particularly dangerous. Its vapors could drive men mad, causing tremors, memory loss, and eventually death. The social status of alchemists was precarious at best, while some, like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon, were respected scholars who pursued alchemy alongside their other studies. Many practitioners existed in a grey area between respectability and criminality. They were often accused of fraud, particularly when their promised transmutations failed to materialize. Kings and nobles who had funded alchemical research sometimes turned violently against their former protégés when the gold failed to appear, viewing them as charlatans who had stolen royal funds under false pretenses. The connection between alchemy and magic was always present, lurking beneath the surface of even the most scholarly treatises. Alchemists claimed their art was natural philosophy, but their methods often involved rituals that seemed indistinguishable from magical practices. They worked according to astrological timing, believing that the positions of planets and stars influenced the success of their operations. They inscribed their vessels with symbols that bore uncomfortable resemblances to the sigils used in demonic summoning. They burned incenses and recited incantations that could easily have been mistaken for spells. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way alchemy began to influence medical practice. Physician alchemists like Paracelsus claimed that the same principles that governed the transmutation of metals could be applied to healing the human body. They created medicines of unprecedented potency, substances that could cure diseases that had previously been considered hopeless. But these same medicines were often poisons in larger doses, and the line between healing and harming became increasingly blurred. The pursuit of the elixir of life, that legendary substance that could grant immortality, led some alchemists to experiment with increasingly exotic and dangerous materials. They distilled the blood of young men, believing it contained the essence of vitality. They sought to extract the quintessence from precious stones, plants, and even human remains. Some claimed to have discovered methods for preserving the body indefinitely, creating what they called the philosophical mercury that could prevent decay and death. But perhaps the darkest aspect of medieval alchemy was its relationship with power and corruption. Kings and princes who sought alchemical knowledge weren't primarily interested in advancing human understanding. They wanted weapons. They wanted gold. They wanted the ability to control and dominate their enemies. The knowledge that alchemists possessed could be used to create poisons that left no trace, explosives that could bring down castle walls, or acids that could eat through the strongest armor. The famous alchemist John Dee, who served as an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, exemplified this dangerous intersection of knowledge and power. Dee claimed to communicate with angels through his crystal ball, receiving instructions for alchemical operations that would grant England dominion over the entire world. His influence over the Queen was so great that many suspected him of using alchemical means to enchant her, bending her will to his own purposes through supernatural means. The workshop practices of medieval alchemists often involved procedures that seemed designed to blur the line between the scientific and the supernatural. They would begin their work only at certain phases of the moon, believing that lunar influences affected the success of their operations. They performed elaborate purification rituals, not just of their materials but of themselves, fasting and praying for days before attempting important transmutations. Some claimed that the presence of a pregnant woman or a menstruating woman could completely ruin an operation, reflecting the deep misogyny that permeated medieval society. The materials used in alchemical operations were often chosen as much for their symbolic significance as for their chemical properties. Cinnabar, with its brilliant red color, represented the blood of the earth. Antimony, which could purify gold while destroying other metals, became a symbol of spiritual purification through trial. Lead, the basest of metals, represented the fallen state of humanity, while gold symbolized divine perfection. These correspondences weren't merely poetic. Alchemists believed they reflected fundamental truths about the nature of reality. The process of creating the philosopher's stone was said to take years or even decades, requiring not just technical skill, but spiritual development on the part of the alchemist. Many practitioners claimed that the stone could only be created by someone who had achieved a state of moral and spiritual perfection, someone who had overcome the base desires of human nature, just as the stone overcame the base nature of common metals. This belief led some alchemists to embrace extreme ascetic practices, depriving themselves of food, sleep, and human companionship in pursuit of the purity necessary for their work. But the pursuit of perfection often led to its opposite. Cut off from normal human society, working in isolation with dangerous materials and exposed to toxic fumes, many alchemists began to exhibit signs of madness. They became obsessed with their work to the exclusion of all else, neglecting their families, their health, and their souls. Some claimed to receive visions of the secret processes they needed to complete their work, but others around them suspected these visions were symptoms of mercury poisoning or simple insanity. The economic impact of alchemy extended far beyond the workshops of individual practitioners. The promise of cheap gold attracted investment from merchants and nobles who saw the potential for enormous profits. Entire fortunes were spent funding alchemical research, money that could have been used to improve the lives of common people or fund more practical endeavors. When these investments inevitably failed, the economic consequences rippled throughout society, contributing to the financial instability that plagued much of medieval Europe. The relationship between alchemy and the emerging universities was complex and often hostile. While some scholars embraced alchemical studies as a legitimate branch of natural philosophy, others viewed it as a corruption of true learning. The universities were supposed to be places where knowledge was shared openly, but alchemy demanded secrecy. Academic debates were meant to be conducted through rational argument, but alchemical disputes often involved accusations of incompetence, fraud, or even demonic influence. The tools and apparatus used by medieval alchemists were marvels of ingenuity, but they were also instruments of potential destruction. The athanor, or philosopher's furnace, could reach temperatures that no ordinary fire could match, hot enough to melt metals that had never been liquefied before. The pelican, a vessel designed for continuous circulation of liquids, could concentrate substances to dangerous levels of potency. The alembic, used for distillation, could separate the most volatile and reactive components from apparently stable compounds. These devices weren't just laboratory equipment, they were sources of power that could be turned to destructive purposes. The same techniques used to purify metals could be used to concentrate poisons. The same furnaces used for transmutation could be used to create weapons of unprecedented destructive capability. Some alchemists openly boasted of their ability to create Greek fire, that legendary incendiary weapon that could burn on water and couldn't be extinguished by conventional means. The secrecy that surrounded alchemical practice wasn't just about protecting trade secrets. It was about survival. In a world where the church could condemn someone as a heretic for holding the wrong opinions about transubstantiation, the alchemical claim to be able to transform substances at their fundamental level was inherently dangerous. The Inquisition kept careful watch on alchemical practitioners, always ready to investigate claims of demonic influence or heretical beliefs. The coded language that alchemists used to describe their processes served multiple purposes. It protected them from persecution by making their work incomprehensible to outsiders. It also created a sense of exclusivity and mystery that attracted new practitioners. But perhaps most importantly, it allowed them to make claims that couldn't be easily tested or disproven. When an alchemical operation failed, the practitioner could always claim that the failure was due to misunderstanding the coded instructions rather than to any fundamental flaw in the theory. The influence of alchemy on medieval medicine was particularly troubling. Physician alchemists claimed that diseases were caused by imbalances in the body's fundamental principles, just as impure metals were caused by imbalances in their elemental composition. This led to treatments that were often more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to cure. Patients were given preparations containing mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances, justified by the belief that these poisons could be transformed into medicines through proper alchemical preparation. The quest for the universal solvent, a substance that could dissolve anything, exemplified the dangerous ambitions of medieval alchemists. Such a substance would have been incredibly valuable for extracting precious metals from ores or for medical applications. but it would also have been a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. The very idea of creating something that could dissolve any container, any barrier, any defense, should have given pause to anyone who considered the implications. The alchemical concept of correspondence, the belief that everything in the universe was connected to everything else through hidden sympathies and influences, led to practices that modern minds would consider delusional at best and dangerous at worst. Alchemists believed that operations performed on metals could influence human health, that the creation of artificial gold could grant the creator supernatural powers, that the success or failure of their work depended on their moral state and spiritual development. As we delve deeper into the darkness that surrounded medieval alchemy, we begin to see how this supposedly noble pursuit of knowledge became entangled with humanity's basest desires for power, wealth, and dominion over others. The alchemist's laboratory was not just a place of learning, but a forge where ambition and desperation were transmuted into practices that threatened the very foundations of medieval society. The apprenticeship system that governed the transmission of alchemical knowledge was particularly prone to abuse. Young men, desperate to learn the secrets of transmutation, would indenture themselves to masters who might or might not possess genuine knowledge. These apprentices were sworn to secrecy, cut off from outside contact, and subjected to years of labor that might amount to nothing more than elaborate deception. Some masters used their apprentices as test subjects for dangerous experiments, justifying the risk by claiming that the knowledge gained would benefit all humanity. The gender dynamics within alchemical practice reflected and amplified the misogyny of medieval society. While some women, like the legendary Mary the Prophetess, were credited with important alchemical discoveries, most practitioners were men who viewed feminine influence as corrupting to their work. The alchemical process itself was often described in terms of violent sexual imagery, with metals being forcibly united in what was called the chemical wedding. This language wasn't merely metaphorical, it reflected deep-seated beliefs about the nature of power and transformation that had disturbing implications for how these men viewed and treated actual women. The international network of alchemical practitioners created opportunities for the spread of dangerous knowledge across political and cultural boundaries. Texts that had been banned in one kingdom could easily resurface in another, translated into new languages and adapted to local conditions. Islamic alchemical knowledge filtered into Christian Europe through Spain and Sicily, bringing with it techniques and theories that European authorities found threatening. Similarly, European innovations found their way into the Islamic world and beyond, creating a global community of practitioners who owed allegiance to no earthly authority. The economic implications of successful alchemy extended far beyond the simple creation of gold. If alchemists could truly transmute base metals, they could potentially control the entire monetary system of medieval Europe. The value of currency depended on the scarcity of precious metals, and unlimited gold production would have destroyed the economic foundations of feudal society. Some rulers secretly funded alchemical research while publicly condemning it, hoping to gain an advantage over their rivals while preventing their enemies from achieving the same breakthrough. The connection between alchemy and astrology added another layer of darkness to the art. Alchemists believed that their work had to be timed according to celestial influences, that the positions of planets and stars affected the success of their operations. This wasn't merely a matter of choosing auspicious dates. It implied that human actions were subject to cosmic forces beyond their control. Such beliefs undermined the Christian doctrine of free will and suggested that ultimate power resided not with God, but with those who could master these hidden influences. The preservation of alchemical knowledge through secret societies and coded manuscripts created a parallel tradition of learning that existed alongside and sometimes in opposition to the official teachings of the church and the universities. These hidden networks allowed dangerous ideas to survive periods of persecution and to spread in ways that were difficult for authorities to monitor or control. The very existence of such networks implied that there were truths too dangerous for ordinary people to know. Knowledge that had to be carefully guarded and transmitted only to the worthy. The psychological toll of alchemical practice was severe and often ignored by those who focused only on the potential rewards. Practitioners spent years in isolation, working with toxic materials, following procedures that often failed for reasons they couldn't understand. The constant exposure to mercury vapor alone was enough to cause permanent neurological damage. But alchemists also worked with arsenic, lead, and other substances that could accumulate in the body over time. The mental effects of this chronic poisoning were often mistaken for divine inspiration or demonic influence, further blurring the line between science and superstition. The quest for artificial life represented perhaps the darkest ambition of medieval alchemy. Some practitioners claimed to have created homunculi, tiny artificial humans grown in glass vessels through alchemical processes. These creatures were said to possess supernatural knowledge and abilities, but their creation required materials and procedures that would have horrified any decent person. The very attempt to create life artificially was seen by many as an usurpation of divine prerogative, a sin so grave that it warranted the most severe punishment. The influence of alchemy on medieval warfare was profound and largely hidden from historical records. Alchemists who served military leaders weren't just creating better alloys for weapons and armor. They were developing incendiary compounds, toxic gases, and other weapons that challenged the chivalric ideals of medieval combat. The knowledge of how to create such weapons was carefully guarded, but its existence changed the calculations of military planners and political leaders throughout Europe. The relationship between alchemy and emerging banking systems was complex and often corrupt. Merchants who claimed to have alchemical knowledge could attract investors and creditors who hoped to profit from transmutation. Some used this supposed knowledge to justify elaborate financial schemes that were essentially early forms of pyramid schemes or Ponzi schemes. When these schemes inevitably collapsed, they often took entire merchant houses and banking families down with them, contributing to the economic instability that plagued much of medieval Europe. The medicinal applications of alchemy were particularly dangerous because they combined genuine therapeutic effects with toxic side effects in ways that weren't well understood. Alchemical preparations containing mercury or antimony might indeed cure certain diseases, but they could also cause permanent damage to the nervous system, kidneys, or other organs. Patients who recovered from their original illness might find themselves suffering from new ailments caused by their treatment, creating a cycle of dependency on increasingly exotic and dangerous remedies. The spiritual claims of alchemy were perhaps the most insidious aspect of the art because they offered apparent religious justification for practices that were fundamentally materialistic and self-serving. Alchemists claimed that their work was a form of prayer, that the transmutation of metals was a reflection of the soul's journey toward perfection, that the philosopher's stone was a symbol of divine grace. These claims allowed them to present their pursuit of wealth and power as a form of religious devotion, making it more difficult for church authorities to condemn their activities without appearing to oppose spiritual development itself. The environmental impact of medieval alchemical practice was severe and largely ignored by practitioners who were focused on their immediate goals. The furnaces used for transmutation consumed enormous quantities of wood and charcoal, contributing to deforestation around major centers of alchemical activity. The toxic waste products of failed experiments were often simply dumped into rivers or buried in shallow pits, contaminating water supplies and soil for generations. The very air around alchemical workshops was poisoned by the constant emission of mercury vapor, sulfur compounds, and other toxic gases. As we reach the end of our exploration into the dark heart of medieval alchemy, we're left with a sobering understanding of how humanity's noblest aspirations can become corrupted when they're pursued without regard for moral constraints or social responsibility. The alchemists of the Middle Ages weren't evil men for the most part. They were seekers of knowledge, driven by curiosity and ambition, hoping to unlock secrets that would benefit all humanity. But their methods, their secrecy, and their willingness to ignore the potential consequences of their work created a tradition that was as dangerous as it was alluring. The legacy of medieval alchemy extends far beyond the eventual development of modern chemistry. It established patterns of secretive research, of knowledge hoarded by elites, of technological development pursued without regard for its social implications. These patterns would resurface again and again throughout history, from the alchemical workshops of the Renaissance to the secret laboratories of the Atomic Age. The true darkness of medieval alchemy lay not in any supernatural evil, but in the very human tendency to pursue power and knowledge without wisdom, to seek transformation without understanding, to promise miracles while creating monsters. In their quest to transmute base metals into gold, the alchemists of the Middle Ages revealed something far more disturbing: the ease with which noble intentions can be corrupted, and the terrible price that society pays when brilliant minds pursue their ambitions without restraint. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those long-ago workshops, filled with flickering flames and bubbling retorts, where men in robes bent over their mysterious work. But remember that the real horror of medieval alchemy wasn't in its failures, but in its partial successes, the moments when practitioners glimpsed genuine power and chose to pursue it regardless of the cost. The medieval world was shrouded in mystery, but none more perilous than the shadowy practice of alchemy. While most peasants toiled in the fields under the watchful eye of their lords, a select few dared to delve into forbidden knowledge that promised untold power. These weren't the learned scholars of great universities, but desperate souls dwelling on the fringes of society, conducting their experiments in hidden cellars and abandoned monasteries, far from the prying eyes of church authorities. You see, by the 14th century, alchemy had evolved far beyond the simple transmutation of base metals into gold. It had become something darker, something that threatened the very foundations of medieval society. The alchemists of this era weren't content with mere wealth. They sought the ultimate prize, the creation of life itself, the power to cheat death, and dominion over the natural world that God had ordained. Consider the case of Brother Marcus, a Benedictine monk who abandoned his vows in 1347 to pursue the great work. In the dank cellars beneath the ruins of an abandoned priory, he constructed an elaborate laboratory filled with glass vessels, furnaces, and arcane instruments. His journals, discovered centuries later, reveal experiments that would make even modern scientists recoil in horror. He wrote of creating artificial beings, homunculi, by combining human blood with mercury and sulfur under specific astrological conditions. The process itself was a grotesque mockery of divine creation. Marcus would begin during the dark of the moon, when malevolent spirits were said to be most active. He'd heat mercury in a sealed vessel for 40 days and nights, adding drops of blood drawn from condemned criminals at the moment of their execution. The resulting amalgam, he claimed, would writhe and pulse with an unholy life of its own. But Marcus wasn't working alone. Across Europe, a network of rogue alchemists shared their forbidden knowledge through coded manuscripts and secret symbols carved into monastery walls. They communicated in a language of dragons and lions, of red kings and white queens, concealing their true purposes from those who would see them burned as heretics. The Church's response was swift and merciless. Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Spondent quas non exhibent in 1317, explicitly condemning alchemical practices as works of the devil. Yet this only drove the practitioners deeper underground, making their work more dangerous and their methods more extreme. Take the notorious case of Nicolas Flamel, the Parisian scrivener who claimed to have discovered the philosopher's stone. While history remembers him as a successful alchemist who achieved transmutation, the darker truth lies in his methods. Flamel's workshop, hidden beneath his scriptorium, was a charnel house of experimentation. He used human remains, grave dirt, and the blood of newborns in his work, believing that life essence was the key component in his elixir of immortality. The psychological toll on these practitioners was immense. Prolonged exposure to mercury vapors caused tremors, hallucinations, and gradual mental deterioration. Many alchemists reported vivid dreams where demons instructed them in their work, and some claimed to have made pacts with infernal powers in exchange for knowledge. The line between scientific inquiry and demonic possession became increasingly blurred. What made medieval alchemy particularly insidious was its parasitic relationship with legitimate learning. Monasteries, the centers of scholarly activity, became breeding grounds for heretical practices. Monks with access to ancient texts and laboratory facilities found themselves drawn into increasingly dangerous experiments. The very institutions meant to preserve Christian knowledge became corrupted from within. The alchemists developed an elaborate mythology around their work, claiming descent from Hermes Trismegistus and drawing upon Islamic, Jewish, and pagan traditions. They believed that through their art, they could reverse the fall of man and return to the primordial state of Adam before the corruption of sin. This wasn't mere metallurgy. It was a direct challenge to Christian doctrine. The equipment alone tells a story of obsession and danger. Alchemical laboratories were filled with athanors, pelicans, and retorts, each designed for specific stages of the great work. The smell of sulfur and burning metals permeated these spaces, while the constant heat from furnaces made them nearly unbearable. Many alchemists suffered severe burns and lung damage from their work, yet they persisted, driven by visions of ultimate power. Perhaps most disturbing were the human experiments. Medieval alchemists believed that the microcosm of the human body reflected the macrocosm of the universe. They conducted vivisections on condemned criminals and the mentally ill, seeking to understand the seat of the soul and the mechanism of life itself. These practices, conducted in secret and without any ethical constraints, represented a complete abandonment of Christian morality. The social impact of alchemy extended far beyond individual practitioners. Entire communities could be thrown into chaos when an alchemist's experiments went wrong. Toxic fumes poisoned wells, strange fires consumed buildings, and unexplained illnesses spread through populations. The people, lacking any understanding of chemistry, attributed these disasters to witchcraft and demonic influence, leading to witch hunts and mass hysteria. The economic disruption was equally severe. Alchemists' claims of being able to produce gold led to widespread counterfeiting and currency manipulation. Kings and nobles, desperate for wealth to fund their wars, secretly patronized alchemical research, undermining the stability of medieval monetary systems. The promise of unlimited gold proved as corrosive to society as any acid in the alchemist's laboratory. Women, too, were drawn into this dark world, though their participation took different forms. Female alchemists often specialized in poisons and love potions, using their knowledge of herbs and distillation to create substances that could kill or control. These women operated in the shadows of medieval society, serving nobles who needed their enemies eliminated quietly or their spouses made compliant. The religious implications were profound and terrifying. Alchemy represented a fundamental rejection of divine providence, replacing faith in God's will with belief in human manipulation of natural forces. Alchemists saw themselves as co-creators with God, or in some cases, as rivals to divine power. This hubris inevitably led to spiritual corruption and, according to church doctrine, eternal damnation. The preservation of alchemical knowledge required elaborate security measures. Manuscripts were written in multiple codes, hidden in false walls, or buried in remote locations. The most dangerous formulas were committed to memory and passed down through chains of master and apprentice, creating secret lineages that persisted for generations. Some knowledge was deliberately fragmented, with different practitioners holding pieces of larger formulas to prevent any single individual from wielding too much power. As the medieval period drew to a close, alchemy's influence had thoroughly permeated European society. What began as a quest for material transformation had become a comprehensive system of thought that challenged every aspect of medieval life. The seeds of the scientific revolution were planted in alchemical laboratories, but so too were the roots of occultism and magical thinking that would persist for centuries. The legacy of medieval alchemy serves as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in the pursuit of knowledge without moral constraints. These practitioners, driven by ambition and desperation, created a shadow science that operated outside the bounds of religious and social authority. Their work advanced human understanding of chemistry and metallurgy, but at a terrible cost in human lives and social stability. The true darkness of medieval alchemy lay not in its failure to transmute lead into gold, but in its success at transmuting human souls into something unrecognizable. The pursuit of transmutation was merely the beginning of alchemy's dark descent into forbidden territories. As practitioners delved deeper into the mysteries of matter and spirit, they began to explore realms that the church and society deemed not just heretical, but genuinely dangerous. The alchemical laboratory, hidden away in castle dungeons or remote forest clearings, became a theatre of operations where the boundaries between science and sorcery dissolved completely. The true darkness of medieval alchemy lay not in its failure to create gold, but in its success at creating something far more sinister. A network of secret knowledge that challenged the very foundations of medieval society. Alchemists began to see themselves as a chosen few, privy to divine secrets that elevated them above common mortals. This hubris would lead them down paths that even today seem shocking in their audacity and moral blindness. Consider the figure of Roger Bacon, the 13th century Franciscan friar whose alchemical pursuits earned him the suspicion of his own order. Bacon's writings, carefully coded to avoid persecution, hint at experiments that went far beyond the simple transformation of base metals. He wrote of creating artificial life, of prolonging human existence indefinitely, and of commanding the very forces of nature through alchemical manipulation. His contemporary, Albertus Magnus, was rumored to have created an artificial man, a homunculus that could speak and reason like a human being. These weren't mere fantasies or metaphorical exercises. Medieval alchemists genuinely believed they could create life from lifeless matter, and they pursued this goal with a dedication that bordered on obsession. The process of creating a homunculus, as described in alchemical texts, involved combining human bodily fluids with various metals and minerals, then subjecting the mixture to precise heating and cooling cycles over periods of months or even years. The ethical implications of such experiments were either ignored or rationalized away through elaborate theological justifications. The alchemical pursuit of immortality proved even more dangerous. Unlike modern medical research, which seeks to extend healthy human life, medieval alchemists often pursued immortality through means that required the exploitation or destruction of others. The legendary Philosopher's Stone was said by some practitioners to require human sacrifice for its creation. Nicolas Flamel, perhaps the most famous alchemist of the medieval period, was rumored to have achieved immortality through his alchemical work, but whispers followed him throughout his life about the true source of his longevity. These whispers weren't entirely unfounded. Alchemical texts from the period contain disturbing references to the use of human blood, organs, and other bodily materials in various experiments. The line between alchemy and necromancy became increasingly blurred as practitioners sought to harness the life force itself. Some alchemists claimed that the essence of youth could be extracted from the young and transferred to the aged, leading to horrifying experiments that would not be out of place in the darkest horror stories. The secrecy that surrounded these practices only intensified their sinister nature. Alchemists developed elaborate systems of symbols, codes, and metaphors to conceal their work from prying eyes. What appeared to be a recipe for transmuting lead into gold might actually be instructions for creating deadly poisons or performing ritual magic. The famous alchemical symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, took on new meaning when understood as a representation of the endless cycle of destruction and creation that alchemists sought to master. This culture of secrecy bred its own darkness. Alchemical societies became closed circles where moral boundaries were gradually eroded through peer pressure and shared complicity. Young apprentices were slowly introduced to increasingly questionable practices, their consciences numbed through a combination of intellectual rationalization and gradual exposure to horror. The pursuit of knowledge became an end in itself, divorced from any consideration of human cost or moral consequence. The economic motivations behind alchemy also contributed to its corruption. Wealthy patrons, desperate for gold or eternal life, provided funding for experiments with few questions asked about methodology. Alchemists found themselves in the position of having to produce results, regardless of the means required. This pressure led to increasingly desperate and dangerous experiments, as practitioners risked everything in pursuit of the ultimate prize. The social isolation of alchemists further contributed to their moral decay. Rejected by mainstream society and condemned by the church, they formed their own communities with their own ethical standards. What would have been unthinkable to a normal medieval citizen became routine within alchemical circles. The taking of human life for experimental purposes, the theft of corpses from graveyards, the kidnapping of children for horrific rituals, all of these became acceptable within the twisted logic of alchemical pursuit. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way that genuine scientific discovery became intertwined with these dark practices. Alchemists did make real advances in chemistry, metallurgy, and medicine. They developed new techniques for distillation, discovered new chemical compounds, and advanced understanding of natural processes. But these legitimate achievements were inseparable from the darker aspects of their work, creating a body of knowledge that was simultaneously valuable and cursed. The apparatus used in these experiments tells its own story of descent into darkness. Alchemical laboratories were filled with strange devices designed not just for chemical processes, but for the manipulation of life itself. Distillation equipment was modified to process human blood and other bodily fluids. Furnaces were designed to accommodate materials that no legitimate craftsman would ever handle. Glass vessels bore symbols and inscriptions that had nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with summoning and binding supernatural forces. The psychological toll on the alchemists themselves was severe. Many showed signs of what we would now recognize as severe mental illness, brought on by exposure to toxic substances, social isolation, and the cognitive dissonance of pursuing knowledge through increasingly immoral means. Their writings from later periods often show paranoia, grandiosity, and a complete disconnection from normal human empathy. They began to see other people not as fellow human beings, but as sources of raw materials for their experiments. The corruption spread beyond individual alchemists to contaminate entire networks of practitioners. Secret societies developed that were devoted not to the advancement of knowledge, but to the accumulation of power through alchemical means. These groups infiltrated royal courts, merchant guilds, and even religious institutions, using their hidden knowledge to manipulate events from behind the scenes. The very secrecy that protected them from persecution also allowed them to operate without oversight or accountability. As these networks grew in power and influence, they began to pose a genuine threat to social stability. Kings and nobles who had once patronized alchemists began to fear them, realizing too late that they had unleashed forces beyond their control. The knowledge that alchemists possessed could be used not just to create gold, but to create poisons undetectable by any known means, to influence minds through chemical manipulation, and to bring about death or madness in enemies from a distance. The environmental impact of alchemical practices was also severe, though little understood at the time. The pursuit of transmutation required the use of mercury, lead, arsenic, and other toxic substances in quantities that contaminated entire regions around alchemical laboratories. Wells were poisoned, soil was rendered barren, and wildlife died in large numbers. The alchemists themselves often suffered from heavy metal poisoning, which may have contributed to their increasingly erratic behavior and moral blindness. The ultimate tragedy of medieval alchemy was not its failure to achieve its stated goals, but its success in demonstrating the depths to which human beings could sink in pursuit of knowledge and power. The practitioners who began as seekers after truth ended as merchants of death. Their laboratories transformed from places of learning into chambers of horror. The secret rites. How medieval alchemists served forbidden masters. But even as they pursued these grandiose dreams of transmutation and enlightenment, many alchemists found themselves drawn into darker territories. Territories that demanded not just their knowledge, but their very souls. For you see, the pursuit of forbidden knowledge rarely comes without a price. And in medieval times, that price was often paid in blood, corruption, and servitude to forces that should never have been awakened. Consider the shadowy figure of Brother Augustin, a Franciscan monk who operated a clandestine laboratory beneath the monastery of Saint-Denis in the 13th century. By day, he ministered to the sick and tended to his religious duties with apparent devotion. By night, he descended into chambers carved from living rock, where the air hung thick with sulphurous vapors and the walls bore inscriptions in languages that predated Christ himself. Augustine's journals, discovered centuries later bricked up behind a false wall, reveal the gradual corruption of a man who began with noble intentions. His early entries speak of wanting to create medicines for the poor, to transmute lead into gold to fund the monastery's charitable works. You see, Augustine had made contact with something through his alchemical workings, something that offered him power beyond his wildest dreams, but demanded ever greater sacrifices in return. At first, it was simple enough. A few drops of his own blood mixed into the crucible. The sacrifice of laboratory animals during specific lunar phases. But the demands escalated, as they always do when one traffics with such entities. The journals described nocturnal expeditions to graveyards, where Augustine would harvest bone dust from the recently buried. They tell of midnight rituals conducted in hidden chambers, where he would burn offerings of rare herbs while chanting incantations that made his throat bleed from the very act of speaking them. And they reveal the ultimate horror, that Augustine was not working alone, but was part of a network of corrupted alchemists spread across medieval Europe, all serving the same dark masters. This network, which they called the Ordo Mortis Aurea, or the Order of the Golden Death, represented the shadow side of medieval alchemy. While public-facing alchemists like Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon pursued their studies within the bounds of Christian doctrine, these secret practitioners delved into arts that would have seen them burned as heretics had their activities been discovered. Their laboratories were temples to corruption, where crucifixes hung upside down, and the tools of their trade were consecrated with blood rather than holy water. They worked not just with mercury and sulfur, but with substances that defied natural law. Powdered meteorites that glowed with their own inner light, crystallized essences extracted from the dying breath of plague victims, oils distilled from plants that grew only in soil soaked with innocent blood. The rituals they performed were grotesque parodies of the Christian Mass. Where a priest would elevate the host, these corrupted alchemists would raise vessels filled with bubbling concoctions of human bile and molten silver. Where hymns should have been sung, they chanted formulae in the Enochian tongue, each syllable causing the very air to shimmer with malevolent energy. Their goal was nothing less than the complete inversion of the natural order. They sought not the philosopher's stone of legend, but something far more sinister. The lapis mortis, or death stone, a substance that could grant immortality through the consumption of life force itself. To create this abomination required the systematic corruption of every element involved in its creation. Water had to be drawn from wells poisoned with the bones of saints. Fire had to be kindled with wood from trees struck by lightning during thunderstorms. Earth had to be gathered from the sites of mass graves, and air had to be captured during the final exhalations of those dying in despair. Each component carried within it not just physical properties, but spiritual corruption that infected everything it touched. The process of creating the Death Stone was said to take 7 years, during which the alchemist would gradually surrender pieces of their humanity to their dark patrons. They would begin to age backwards, but at a terrible cost. Their memories would fade, replaced with alien knowledge that drove many to madness. Their bodies would become vessels for entities from beyond the veil, sharing space with consciousnesses that viewed human suffering as a form of entertainment. Brother Augustine's final entries describe the completion of his great work. He writes of the moment when the Death Stone finally coalesced in his crucible, a sphere of absolute blackness that seemed to devour light itself. But his triumph was short-lived. The journal ends abruptly with a single line repeated dozens of times. They have come to collect. They have come to collect. When his body was found 3 days later, it had been aged to dust while still maintaining its human form. A gentle touch was enough to reduce him to a pile of grey powder, leaving only his robes and the terrible knowledge contained within his hidden laboratory. The Order of the Golden Death did not die with Augustin. If anything, his fate served as a cautionary tale that only made the surviving members more careful in their activities. They developed elaborate codes for communicating with one another, hidden within seemingly innocent alchemical treatises. They created safe houses in major cities where members could find sanctuary when their activities attracted unwanted attention. And they recruited new members from among the desperate and the ambitious, those who would willingly trade their souls for a taste of forbidden power. These recruiting efforts often targeted young alchemists who had shown promise but lacked the resources to pursue their studies through legitimate means. The Order would approach them through intermediaries, offering access to rare texts and materials that could not be obtained through normal channels. The initial requests seemed harmless enough. Copy this formula. Test this procedure. Report your results through the designated channels. But with each task completed, the young alchemist would find themselves drawn deeper into the Order's web of corruption. The formulas they copied contained hidden meanings that only became clear when combined with others. The procedures they tested required increasingly questionable materials, and the results they reported were used to further the Order's ultimate goal of opening permanent gateways between our world and the realms of their dark patrons. One such recruit was Elena of Padua, a brilliant young woman who had disguised herself as a man to study at the university. Her natural talent for alchemical work caught the attention of Order representatives, who saw in her both potential and vulnerability. Trapped between her desire for knowledge and the constant fear of discovery, Elena was particularly susceptible to their offers of assistance. They provided her with a private laboratory where she could work without fear of exposure. They gave her access to texts that had been banned by the church for centuries, and they offered her a chance to pursue the great work without the constant interference of male colleagues who questioned her right to study alongside them. What Elena didn't realize was that her new patrons were slowly corrupting her research. The texts they provided had been altered in subtle ways, introducing blasphemous elements into otherwise legitimate alchemical procedures. The laboratory they gave her was built over a site where the Order had conducted human sacrifices for decades, and the very walls were saturated with malevolent energy that influenced her thinking. Gradually, Elena's work began to change. Her early experiments with plant essences gave way to studies of animal humors. Her attempts to purify base metals evolved into efforts to corrupt precious ones, and her quest for the Philosopher's Stone transformed into something far more sinister: the creation of homunculi, artificial beings animated by trapped human souls. The process Elena developed was a masterpiece of corrupted alchemy. She would begin by creating a mixture of human blood, semen, and bone marrow, combined with specific minerals that could only be found in certain cursed locations. This mixture would be sealed in a glass vessel and buried in consecrated ground for 40 days and 40 nights, during which time Elena would perform daily rituals to imbue it with the necessary spiritual energy. When the vessel was finally unearthed, the contents would have transformed into a fleshy mass roughly the size and shape of a human infant. But this was not life as God intended it. The homunculus was animated by a human soul that had been torn from its natural path to the afterlife and bound to serve its creator. These souls, trapped in artificial flesh, were driven mad by their unnatural existence and became sources of immense suffering for all who encountered them. Elena created dozens of these abominations before she finally understood the true nature of her work. The realization came when she recognized the face of her first homunculus. It bore the features of her younger brother, who had died of plague the previous year. The Order had somehow captured his soul during its journey to the afterlife and provided it to Elena as raw material for her experiments. The horror of what she had done drove Elena to attempt to destroy her creations and expose the Order's activities to the church authorities. But the Order had anticipated this possibility. On the night she planned to flee Padua with evidence of their crimes, Elena was found in her laboratory, her body contorted in impossible ways and her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure brought on by excessive study, but those who found her noted that every glass vessel in the laboratory had been shattered from the inside, as if something had tried desperately to escape. The homunculi were never found, though rumors persisted for years of strange children seen wandering the countryside around Padua, children who cast no shadows, and whose touch brought madness to all who encountered them. Stories like Eleanor's were whispered in the secret corners of medieval society, serving as warnings to those who might be tempted to pursue knowledge at any cost. But for every alchemist who heeded these warnings, there were others who saw them as challenges to be overcome. The lure of forbidden power proved too strong for many to resist, and the Order of the Golden Death continued to grow throughout the medieval period. Their influence extended far beyond individual alchemists. They infiltrated royal courts, offering their services to kings and nobles who desired power over their enemies. They established secret schools where the children of the wealthy could be taught the dark arts alongside more conventional subjects. And they created vast networks of spies and informants who helped them identify potential threats to their activities. The Order's ultimate goal was nothing less than the complete transformation of human society. They believed that by corrupting enough individuals and introducing sufficient chaos into the world, they could weaken the barriers between dimensions and allow their otherworldly patrons to manifest permanently in our reality. This would usher in a new age where the natural order would be overturned, and those who had served the dark powers would be rewarded with dominion over the corrupted earth. To achieve this goal, they needed to corrupt not just individual alchemists, but the very practice of alchemy itself. They began introducing false information into legitimate texts, creating confusion and doubt among honest practitioners. They sponsored public demonstrations of alchemical procedures that ended in spectacular failures, discrediting the entire field in the eyes of secular authorities. And they spread rumors linking alchemy to heresy and witchcraft, ensuring that practitioners would be driven underground where the Order could more easily control them. The Order's most ambitious project was the creation of what they called the Magnum Maleficium, or Great Evil Work. This was to be a massive alchemical operation conducted simultaneously across multiple locations throughout Europe, designed to create a permanent rift in reality that would allow their patrons to cross over en masse. The ritual required precise coordination between dozens of corrupted alchemists, each performing their part of the greater working at exactly the right moment. The scale of preparation involved was staggering. Rare materials had to be gathered from across the known world. Sites of ancient power had to be identified and prepared through months of preliminary rituals, and the timing had to be calculated to coincide with a rare astronomical alignment that occurred only once every several centuries. For 3 years, the Order worked toward this goal, sacrificing everything in pursuit of their ultimate victory. They abandoned all pretense of secrecy, openly recruiting new members and establishing laboratories in major cities throughout Europe. They assassinated church officials who investigated their activities too closely, and they began stockpiling the massive quantities of corrupted materials necessary for their great working. But their hubris proved to be their downfall. The scale of their activities finally attracted the attention of the Church's most elite investigators, men who had been trained specifically to combat supernatural threats. Led by a mysterious figure known only as Father Mordecai, these investigators began systematically hunting down Order members and destroying their laboratories. Father Mordecai was himself a former alchemist, one who had glimpsed the true nature of the forces the Order served and dedicated his life to opposing them. He understood their methods because he had once practiced them himself, and he knew their weaknesses because he had once shared them. His investigators were equipped with blessed weapons and protective talismans, and they moved with the efficiency of those who understood exactly what they faced. The final confrontation came on the night the Order attempted to perform the Magnum Maleficium. As alchemists across Europe began their synchronized ritual, Father Mordecai's forces struck simultaneously at multiple locations. The battles that followed were unlike anything seen before or since, combining physical combat with supernatural warfare that left entire city blocks in ruins. In London, the Order's laboratory was hidden beneath the tower itself, and the fighting that erupted there was said to have caused the Thames to run red for 3 days. In Paris, the conflict centered around Notre Dame Cathedral, where Order members had attempted to corrupt the very foundations of the holy site. And in Rome, the battle raged through the catacombs themselves, where the ancient dead rose to defend their resting places against desecration. The Order's defeat was total and devastating. Those members who were not killed in the fighting were subjected to special church tribunals that condemned them to fates worse than mere execution. Their laboratories were not just destroyed, but consecrated, ensuring that the corruption they contained could never again take root. And their texts and materials were gathered and sealed away in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, where they remain to this day. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The incomplete Magnum Maleficium had still managed to weaken the barriers between worlds, creating dozens of small rifts that allowed lesser entities to slip through into our reality. These creatures, feeding on human fear and suffering, became the basis for many of the monster legends that plagued Europe for centuries afterward. Moreover, the destruction of the Order scattered its surviving members across the globe, where they established new cells and began the slow process of rebuilding their organization. They learned from their mistakes, becoming more secretive and more careful in their recruitment. And they adapted their methods to work within the changing intellectual climate of the Renaissance and beyond. The legacy of the Order of the Golden Death serves as a grim reminder of the dangers inherent in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Medieval alchemy, for all its genuine scientific achievements, also opened doors that should have remained closed. It attracted individuals who were willing to sacrifice not just their own humanity, but the safety of all mankind, in pursuit of power and immortality. These corrupted practitioners left behind a trail of suffering that extended far beyond their own lifetimes. The entities they summoned did not simply vanish when their masters died. The rifts they opened did not automatically seal themselves, and the knowledge they accumulated did not disappear with them, but rather passed into the hands of new generations of seekers who believed they could succeed where their predecessors had failed. In the hidden archives of ancient monasteries and the secret vaults of noble families, fragments of their work still survive. Partial formulas written in languages that hurt the mind to read, diagrams of ritual circles that seem to shift and change when viewed directly, and warnings scrawled in margins by those who recognized the true nature of what they had discovered and tried desperately to prevent others from following the same dark path. The true horror of medieval alchemy's shadow side lies not in the dramatic battles between good and evil, but in the gradual corruption of individuals who began with noble intentions. Every member of the Order of the Golden Death started as someone seeking knowledge, healing, or enlightenment. But step by step, compromise by compromise, they allowed themselves to be drawn into practices that ultimately consumed not just their souls, but their very humanity. And perhaps most terrifying of all, they enjoyed it. The surviving records make clear that these corrupted alchemists took genuine pleasure in their dark work. They reveled in the power it gave them over others. They delighted in the forbidden knowledge they accumulated. And they found a twisted satisfaction in serving masters whose ultimate goal was the destruction of everything they had once held dear. This, then, was the true dark truth behind medieval alchemy. Not simply that it was dangerous or that it sometimes failed, but that it could transform good people into willing servants of evil. It offered a path to power that seemed reasonable and justified, but ultimately led to damnation for those who walked it too far. And it left behind a legacy of corruption that continues to influence the hidden corners of our world to this very day. The wise reader will take these words as both warning and wisdom. Knowledge is indeed power, but power without wisdom is destruction. The pursuit of truth is noble, but truth pursued without moral foundation becomes its own form of lie. And the desire to transcend human limitations, while natural and understandable, can lead to the loss of everything that makes us human in the first place. In the flickering candlelight of ancient laboratories, in the whispered incantations of forgotten rituals, and in the desperate screams of those who paid the ultimate price for forbidden knowledge, we can still hear the echoes of medieval alchemy's darkest secrets. The blood of innocence seeps deeper into the soil than anyone could have imagined. Behind the ritual circles and mystical symbols that common folk glimpsed in moonlit clearings lay a far more sinister truth. The Order of the Golden Death had successfully opened doorways that should never have been breached. From the void beyond came entities of such malevolence that even the most hardened alchemists recoiled in horror. These otherworldly beings demanded payment in the currency they valued most: human suffering and spiritual corruption. The Order, drunk on their newfound power, readily complied. They established underground chambers beneath monasteries and manor houses, spaces consecrated in reverse, where the screams of victims would never reach the surface. Here, they conducted experiments that would make the creation of homunculi seem like child's play. The Possessed alchemists began harvesting not just blood and organs, but the very essence of their victims' souls. They discovered methods to trap spiritual energy in crystalline matrices, creating what they called soul stones. These artifacts pulsed with trapped consciousness, the awareness of the murdered still intact within their glassy prisons. The stones became focal points for ritual magic of unprecedented power, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The corruption spread like a plague through the alchemical community. Masters who had spent decades seeking the philosopher's stone abandoned their noble pursuits for these darker arts. They learned to distill fear itself, to crystallize despair, to ferment hatred into potent elixirs that could drive entire populations to madness. The very air around their laboratories became thick with malevolent energy, causing birds to fall dead from the sky and crops to wither in nearby fields. As word of these abominations reached the church hierarchy, a secret war began to unfold. Inquisitors, armed with blessed silver and holy water, descended upon suspected alchemical strongholds, only to find chambers empty, save for the lingering stench of sulfur and the faint echo of otherworldly laughter. The Order had learned to hide their activities, not just from prying eyes, but from the physical realm itself, conducting their work in spaces that existed between dimensions. The true horror was yet to come. The entities from beyond had not come merely to corrupt and destroy. They were scouts, preparing the way for something far worse. Through their human servants, they began constructing a massive ritual apparatus that spanned the entire breadth of medieval Europe. Stone circles, corrupted churches, and defiled holy sites formed nodes in a vast network of dark energy. Each successful ritual, each innocent life claimed, each soul trapped in crystalline bondage, added power to this growing web of malevolence. The Order's ultimate goal was nothing less than the complete inversion of reality itself. They sought to tear open a permanent gateway between dimensions, allowing their otherworldly masters to pour into the mortal realm like a tide of living nightmare. The philosopher's stone, they had learned, was never meant to transform lead into gold. It was a key, a cosmic tool, designed to unlock the barriers between worlds and usher in an age of eternal darkness. Medieval chroniclers, those few who survived to record these events, wrote of strange portents in the final years before the Great Dying. The sun would sometimes appear black at noon, while the moon bled crimson light across the landscape. Animals were born with extra limbs or missing faces, and children spoke in tongues they had never learned. The very fabric of creation seemed to be unraveling at the seams. The church's response grew increasingly desperate. Entire monasteries were mobilized to pray without ceasing, their voices raised in constant supplication against the growing darkness. Holy relics were moved in secret convoys, protected by knights who had taken vows of silence. The Pope himself was said to have performed rituals so ancient and terrible that they aged him a decade in a single night, his hair turning white and his eyes becoming pools of reflected starlight. But perhaps most terrifying of all was what happened to the common people caught in this supernatural war. Entire villages would simply vanish overnight, leaving behind only empty houses and the smell of burned offerings. Farmers would find their livestock arranged in precise geometric patterns, drained of blood, but showing no wounds. Children would disappear from their beds, only to return days later speaking of beautiful gardens where flowers grew from human bones and rivers ran with liquid silver. The Order's corruption had become so complete that they no longer resembled anything human. Their bodies, sustained by otherworldly energies, had begun to change. Some developed additional eyes that could see across dimensional boundaries. Others grew appendages that existed partially in other realms, allowing them to manipulate reality itself. Their very presence became toxic to normal humans, causing madness, illness, and spiritual decay in all who encountered them. The knowledge they had accumulated filled libraries that existed in folded space, books written in languages that predated human civilization. These tomes contained formulae for unmaking the bonds that held atoms together, instructions for summoning beings whose names could not be spoken without tearing holes in reality, and maps of cosmic regions where the laws of physics were merely suggestions. As the medieval period drew to its close, the Order of the Golden Death stood on the verge of achieving their ultimate goal. The great ritual was nearly complete, the dimensional barriers worn thin by centuries of abuse. Soon, they believed, their otherworldly masters would stride forth into the mortal realm, and the age of humanity would end in an orgy of cosmic horror that would make their previous atrocities seem like gentle mercy. The legacy of medieval alchemy's darkest chapter serves as a warning that echoes through the ages. The pursuit of knowledge without wisdom, power without responsibility, and transcendence without morality leads inevitably to corruption and destruction. The Order's fate reminds us that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some prices, once paid, can never be refunded. In their relentless quest to become more than human, they had become something far worse than any demon their fevered imaginations could have conceived. The shadows cast by their actions stretch far beyond the medieval period, influencing secret societies and occult organizations that persist to this day. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge has always carried a heavy price, but in medieval alchemy, that price was often steeper than anyone could have imagined. While we've explored how alchemists pushed past the boundaries of natural law, opening portals to otherworldly realms, and summoning entities beyond human comprehension, the true darkness was yet to reveal itself. For in the shadows of their laboratories, away from prying eyes and moral judgment, the most ambitious practitioners began to realize a terrible truth. Their greatest discoveries would demand the ultimate sacrifice. As news of the failed ritual spread through the hidden networks of alchemical practitioners, a profound shift began to take hold. The catastrophic attempt to breach the fundamental barriers of reality had succeeded in ways its architects never intended. Rather than opening a controlled gateway to otherworldly power, the ritual had created something far more dangerous: cracks in the very foundation of existence itself. These fissures, invisible to ordinary sight but glaringly apparent to those versed in the hidden arts, began to leak energies that defied all understanding. The first signs were subtle. Practitioners working in laboratories hundreds of miles from the ritual site reported strange phenomena during their experiments. Transmutation circles would spontaneously ignite with colors that had no names. Philosophical mercury would writhe and move as if alive, forming patterns that hurt to look upon directly. Most disturbing of all, the homunculi that alchemists had labored so carefully to create began to exhibit behaviors that suggested they were no longer entirely under their creator's control. Brother Marcus, working in his hidden laboratory beneath the monastery of St. Aldrich, was among the first to document these changes. His journal entries from this period reveal a growing sense of unease as his carefully controlled experiments began to yield unpredictable results. Where once he could reliably transmute base metals into silver, now his furnaces produced substances that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. His homunculus, previously docile and obedient, began speaking in languages that predated human civilization, describing realms that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. More troubling still were the reports filtering in from across Europe of alchemists simply vanishing from their laboratories. These weren't cases of practitioners fleeing persecution or abandoning their work in fear. These were complete disappearances, leaving behind laboratories filled with still bubbling retorts and half-completed transmutation circles. as if the alchemists had simply stepped out of existence mid-experiment. In some cases, witnesses reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the abandoned workspaces, beings that cast no reflection and left no footprints, methodically examining the abandoned work with obvious intelligence and purpose. The network of correspondence that had once allowed alchemists to share discoveries and collaborate on grand projects now carried increasingly desperate messages. Practitioners pleaded for guidance, for explanations of phenomena that seemed to violate even the most esoteric principles of their art. Some wrote of dreams that felt more real than waking life, visions of vast cosmic mechanisms grinding towards some incomprehensible purpose. Others described a growing sensation that they were being watched, not by human authorities, but by intelligences so alien that merely acknowledging their presence was enough to drive lesser minds to madness. He called for a gathering of the most accomplished practitioners, hoping to pool their knowledge and find some way to contain or reverse the damage that had been done. But even as he penned his urgent letters, Aldrich was discovering that his own understanding of alchemical principles was becoming increasingly unreliable. Formulas that had worked flawlessly for decades now produced results that defied all logic. His attempts to divine the future through scrying showed only darkness, an endless void that seemed to pull at his consciousness whenever he gazed too deeply into it. The gathering that Aldrich had hoped would save them never took place. 3 days before the scheduled meeting, his apprentice found the master's laboratory empty, save for a single transmutation circle, drawn in what appeared to be liquid starlight. The circle pulsed with its own inner radiance, and those who looked upon it reported hearing whispers in languages that predated human speech. The apprentice, showing wisdom beyond his years, sealed the laboratory with iron bands inscribed with protective wards and fled Prague that very night. As the supernatural crisis deepened, those alchemists who remained began to understand that they faced a choice that would define not only their own fates, but potentially the fate of all human knowledge. They could abandon their life's work, destroy their laboratories, and burn their texts in hopes of containing the growing supernatural contagion. Or they could press forward, accepting that their pursuit of ultimate knowledge might require them to sacrifice not only their own humanity, but their very existence as they understood it. For many, the choice was made for them. Reports came of entire alchemical societies simply ceasing to exist overnight, their meeting halls found empty, their members vanished without a trace. But rather than being random disappearances, these seemed to follow a pattern. The most ambitious practitioners, those who had delved deepest into the forbidden arts, were the first to vanish. It was as if some vast intelligence was systematically harvesting those who had proven themselves capable of touching the deepest mysteries. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, the remaining alchemists found themselves driven by an obsession that had grown beyond mere curiosity or desire for power. The partial success of the great ritual had shown them glimpses of cosmic truths so profound that abandoning the pursuit now seemed not just cowardly, but spiritually impossible. They had touched the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself, and that touch had changed them in ways that made returning to ordinary existence unthinkable. In hidden laboratories across Europe, the surviving practitioners began working with a desperate intensity. They no longer sought the traditional goals of alchemy. The philosopher's stone and the elixir of life seemed like child's toys compared to the cosmic forces they now grappled with. Instead, they pursued understanding of the entities that had begun manifesting in their experiments, beings that existed partially in their reality and partially in dimensions that human language couldn't adequately describe. These entities, when they deigned to communicate at all, spoke of purposes that spanned eons and of changes coming to the world that would reshape the very nature of existence. They offered knowledge beyond imagining, but always at prices that grew steeper with each revelation. Some alchemists traded years of their lives for single insights into the nature of reality. Others offered up their memories, their personalities, even their fundamental sense of self in exchange for glimpses of cosmic truth. The most desperate practitioners began experimenting with rituals that would have horrified even their former selves. They discovered that the entities they had contacted responded favorably to offerings of human consciousness itself, not merely death, which was a crude and limited sacrifice, but the voluntary surrender of one's individual existence in service to incomprehensible cosmic purposes. These alchemists found that they could trade away aspects of their humanity, their capacity for love, their ability to feel fear, their connection to other human beings, in exchange for knowledge that allowed them to manipulate reality in ways that had previously been impossible. Brother Marcus documented his own transformation in journal entries that became increasingly difficult to understand as they progressed. His early writings spoke of reluctant sacrifices made in service to greater understanding. But as the entries continued, they revealed a consciousness that was becoming something fundamentally other than human. His handwriting changed, incorporating symbols that seemed to shift and move on the page. His language became increasingly abstract, describing experiences and insights that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human perception. In his final entry, written in what appeared to be liquid mercury that somehow retained its metallic sheen on the parchment, Marcus described the completion of his transformation. He wrote of consciousness expanding beyond the confines of individual existence, of becoming part of a vast network of intelligences that spanned multiple dimensions. He expressed no regret for what he had lost, but rather joy at what he had become. The transformation of practitioners like Marcus represented the emergence of something entirely new in the world. These beings retained fragments of their human memories and knowledge, but they now served purposes that were fundamentally alien to human understanding. They became intermediaries between the cosmic entities and the remaining human practitioners, offering increasingly powerful knowledge in exchange for ever greater sacrifices. Under their guidance, the surviving alchemists began working on projects that dwarfed anything attempted during the art's previous history. They constructed apparatus that existed partially in multiple dimensions, allowing them to manipulate forces that had no names in any human language. They developed new forms of mathematical notation capable of describing geometric relationships that existed outside normal space-time. Most significantly, they began preparing for what their transformed colleagues described as the final convergence, an event that would merge their reality with the dimensions from which the entities originated. The preparations for this convergence required resources that went far beyond what individual practitioners could provide. The transformed alchemists began infiltrating positions of power throughout medieval society, using their supernatural abilities to manipulate kings, bishops, and merchant princes. They established trade routes that secretly transported exotic materials needed for their cosmic apparatus. They founded religious orders whose true purpose was to gather and train individuals with the psychic sensitivity required for the final ritual. Most insidiously, they began seeding their advanced knowledge throughout human civilization, but always in forms that would lead inevitably toward the convergence. They introduced architectural principles that subtly altered the flow of supernatural energies through major cities. They influenced the development of new artistic techniques that trained human consciousness to perceive realities beyond normal existence. They even guided certain theological developments, encouraging the emergence of mystical traditions that would prepare human souls for the radical transformation that was to come. The scope of this infiltration was staggering. Evidence suggests that by the late medieval period, virtually every major center of learning and power in Europe had been touched by alchemical influence. Universities taught mathematics that contained hidden formulas for manipulating reality. Cathedrals were constructed according to plans that incorporated dimensional gateways disguised as architectural features. Even the development of banking and commerce followed patterns designed to concentrate the resources needed for the final ritual. Yet despite their growing power and influence, the transformed alchemists faced increasing resistance from unexpected sources. The very success of their infiltration had begun to awaken countervailing forces within human civilization. Religious mystics began experiencing visions that warned of a great spiritual threat to humanity. Folk practitioners of magic, working with traditions far older than formal alchemy, sensed the disturbance in the natural order and began developing protective techniques. Most significantly, a new generation of alchemists emerged who sought to understand and counter the supernatural threat rather than surrender to it. These resistant practitioners, calling themselves the guardians of the natural order, worked in even greater secrecy than their corrupted colleagues. They developed techniques for detecting and neutralizing dimensional incursions. They created protective wards capable of shielding entire cities from supernatural influence. Most importantly, they began documenting the true history of alchemy's corruption, hoping to preserve the knowledge needed to prevent future catastrophes. The conflict between the transformed alchemists and the guardians remained largely invisible to ordinary society, but its effects rippled through every aspect of medieval life. Natural disasters increased in frequency and severity as the fabric of reality became increasingly unstable. Plagues emerged that seemed to target specific bloodlines, suggesting supernatural rather than natural origins. Wars erupted with unusual intensity, as if some external force was deliberately increasing human suffering to weaken resistance to the coming convergence. The Guardians worked desperately to counter these effects while simultaneously preparing for what they knew would be an ultimate confrontation. They established hidden sanctuaries where uncorrupted knowledge could be preserved. They developed new forms of protective magic based on principles that predated the corruption of formal alchemy. Most crucially, they began training successors who could carry on their work should they fail to prevent the convergence. As the medieval period drew to a close, both sides prepared for a final conflict that would determine the future of human consciousness itself. The transformed alchemists completed their preparations for the convergence, constructing dimensional apparatus of staggering complexity and gathering the psychic energy needed to tear open permanent gateways between realities. The Guardians, meanwhile, prepared for what they termed the Great Working, a counter-ritual designed to seal the dimensional breaches and banish the entity influence back to their home dimensions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether humanity would retain its fundamental nature or be transformed into something unrecognizably alien. The corrupted alchemists, no longer truly human themselves, saw the convergence as evolution, a necessary step toward cosmic enlightenment. The Guardians viewed it as the ultimate violation of natural law, a perversion that would destroy everything that made human existence meaningful. Neither side could foresee that their conflict would echo through history, influencing the development of human civilization in ways both subtle and profound. The knowledge they fought over would survive in hidden forms, waiting for future generations to rediscover both its promise and its terrible price. The entities that had corrupted medieval alchemy would not simply disappear if defeated, but would retreat to dimensional spaces where they could wait for new opportunities to influence human development. The dark truth behind medieval alchemy was that it had never been merely about transforming base metals into gold or discovering the secrets of immortality. From its earliest origins, it had been part of a vast cosmic plan to prepare humanity for integration into a larger dimensional community. The practitioners who had thought themselves the masters of hidden knowledge had in fact been servants of intelligences whose purposes remained largely incomprehensible to human minds. As we shall see, the final confrontation between the corrupted alchemists and the Guardians would not end the story, but merely transform it, scattering the participants and their knowledge across time and space in ways that would continue to influence human development for centuries to come. The residual corruption from the Order's experiments haunted Europe long after their formal dissolution. Ancient towers and forgotten laboratories, once centers of their dark research, became focal points for supernatural manifestations that would plague communities for centuries. These corrupted sites pulsed with malevolent energy, their very stones stained by the essence of otherworldly beings that had been summoned and trapped within our reality. In the depths of abandoned monasteries turned alchemical workshops, strange phenomena persisted with disturbing regularity. Witnesses reported seeing ghostly figures in hooded robes moving through chambers where no living soul had walked for decades. The air itself seemed thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that made animals refuse to enter and left sensitive individuals overcome with inexplicable dread. Local villagers learned to avoid these places entirely, passing down warnings through generations about the cursed ground where unnatural experiments had once taken place. The Order's attempts to create artificial life had left particularly troubling legacies. In scattered locations across the continent, misshapen creatures still roamed the wilderness, neither fully alive nor completely dead. These homunculi, as they were known in the forbidden texts, possessed a terrible hunger for human life force. They appeared as grotesque parodies of human form, their flesh pale and translucent, their eyes burning with an inner fire that spoke of souls trapped between worlds. Travelers who ventured too close to their lairs often disappeared entirely, leaving behind only strange markings burned into the earth and an overwhelming sense of cosmic wrongness. The soul stones created by the Order's darkest experiments continued to exert their influence long after their creators had perished. These crystalline artifacts, forged from the compressed essence of human souls, retained a malevolent consciousness that sought to corrupt anyone who came into contact with them. Hidden in forgotten vaults and buried beneath ancient ruins, they called out to the desperate and the ambitious, promising power beyond imagination, while slowly consuming the very essence of those who dared to use them. Medieval scholars who discovered fragments of the Order's research found themselves drawn into the same web of corruption that had ensnared their predecessors. The knowledge contained within these texts was like a poison that infected the mind, gradually eroding moral boundaries and replacing human compassion with an insatiable hunger for forbidden understanding. Many who began as sincere seekers of truth ended as hollow shells of their former selves, their humanity sacrificed on the altar of cosmic enlightenment. The dimensional rifts torn open by the Order's experiments proved nearly impossible to seal completely. These tears, in reality, acted as permanent wounds in the fabric of existence, allowing entities from beyond our world to seep through, like infection through broken skin. Around these rifts, the laws of nature became unreliable. Time flowed differently, gravity shifted unpredictably, and the boundary between dreams and reality grew dangerously thin. Entire regions became uninhabitable as the influence of these otherworldly intrusions spread like a spiritual plague. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of possession that began to surface in areas where the Order had been most active. Unlike the demonic possessions recognized by the Church, these cases involved something far more alien and terrifying. The possessed spoke in languages that predated human civilization, their bodies contorting into impossible configurations as entities from parallel dimensions attempted to inhabit forms never designed to contain them. Exorcisms proved largely ineffective against these intrusions, as the invading consciousness existed on planes of reality that traditional religious practices could not reach. The Order's research into temporal manipulation had created pockets of distorted time throughout Europe. In these cursed locations, past, present, and future became tangled together in ways that defied comprehension. Visitors might encounter their own descendants, witness events that had not yet occurred, or become trapped in endless loops of causality. Some of these temporal anomalies grew larger over time, threatening to engulf entire cities in chronological chaos. Underground networks of the Order's surviving members continued to operate in secret, passing down their corrupted knowledge through carefully selected apprentices. These hidden cells worked tirelessly to complete the great work their predecessors had begun, believing that the cosmic convergence could still be achieved with proper preparation and sacrifice. They infiltrated monasteries, universities, and noble courts, spreading their influence like a cancer through medieval society while maintaining facades of respectability and piety. The environmental devastation caused by the Order's experiments created dead zones where nothing natural could grow or thrive. The soil itself had been poisoned by exposure to otherworldly energies, turning fertile farmland into barren wastelands that remained sterile for generations. Strange metallic growths emerged from the earth in these regions, forming crystalline structures that hummed with alien frequencies and emitted a sickly luminescence that could be seen for miles on moonless nights. Weather patterns became increasingly erratic in areas where the Order had conducted their most ambitious rituals. Storms would appear without warning, bringing rain that burned like acid and lightning that struck in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The wind itself carried whispers in languages that human throats were never meant to speak, driving listeners to madness with promises of power and revelations that mortal minds could not safely comprehend. The Order's attempts to merge human consciousness with cosmic entities had created hybrid beings that existed partially in our reality and partially in dimensions beyond human understanding. These creatures appeared human at first glance, but possessed knowledge and abilities that marked them as fundamentally other. They moved through medieval society like living contradictions, simultaneously ancient and newborn, wise and utterly alien. Their very presence warped the fabric of local reality, causing minor miracles and disasters in equal measure as the natural world struggled to accommodate their impossible existence. Sacred sites throughout Europe found themselves corrupted by the Order's dark rituals. Ancient stone circles and holy wells that had been centers of spiritual power for millennia became focal points for malevolent energy. Pilgrims who visited these locations seeking divine blessing instead encountered visions of cosmic horror that shattered their faith and left them wandering the countryside as hollow-eyed prophets of despair, spreading madness through their incoherent ravings about the true nature of reality. The Order's legacy of corruption extended even into the realm of human reproduction. Children born in areas heavily influenced by their experiments often displayed disturbing abnormalities that went far beyond physical deformity. These offspring possessed an innate understanding of cosmic forces that terrified their parents and neighbors. They spoke of distant worlds and alien geometries with the casual familiarity of children discussing their toys, and their presence seemed to attract supernatural phenomena that defied rational explanation. Medieval physicians attempting to treat victims of the Order's experiments found their medical knowledge utterly inadequate. Patients exhibited symptoms that belonged to no known disease, their bodies transforming in ways that suggested influence from forces beyond the physical world. Bloodletting and herbal remedies proved not only useless, but often accelerated the mysterious ailments, as if the corruption fed on traditional healing methods and grew stronger in response to conventional treatment. The Order's research into consciousness transfer had left behind apparatus that continued to function long after their creators' deaths. These machines, built from combinations of alchemical materials and otherworldly substances, operated according to principles that violated every known law of natural philosophy. They hummed with malevolent purpose in abandoned laboratories, occasionally capturing the souls of unwary explorers and adding their consciousness to the growing collection of trapped minds that powered their incomprehensible mechanisms. As the centuries passed, the true scope of the Order's corruption became increasingly apparent. Their influence had not been limited to their own lifetime, but had planted seeds of cosmic horror that would continue to bloom throughout the medieval period and beyond. Each new generation would face the consequences of their ancestors' hubris, struggling against supernatural forces that grew stronger and more sophisticated with each passing year. The Guardians who had initially opposed the Order found themselves engaged in an endless war against corruption that seemed to regenerate faster than it could be contained. For every rift they sealed, two more would tear open. For every corrupted artifact they destroyed, three more would surface from hidden caches. The battle for humanity's survival had become a holding action against forces that possessed infinite patience and resources drawn from dimensions where conventional notions of victory and defeat held no meaning. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, pockets of resistance continued to emerge. New generations of Guardians arose, armed with hard-won knowledge about the Order's methods, and motivated by an unshakable determination to protect humanity from cosmic predators. These brave souls understood that their war might never truly end, but they also knew that every day they delayed. The final convergence was another day that children could play in sunlight, that lovers could meet in gardens, and that human civilization could continue its fragile dance upon the surface of an infinitely mysterious and dangerous universe. The dark truth behind medieval alchemy was not merely that some practitioners had sought forbidden knowledge, but that they had succeeded in touching something vast and alien that regarded humanity as nothing more than raw material for incomprehensible experiments. The corruption they had unleashed would echo through the centuries, a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed again. The shadows of dawn crept through the narrow windows of the monastery scriptorium, where Brother Marcus bent over his weathered desk, quills scratching against parchment as he recorded another failed transmutation. What had begun as noble pursuits, the quest to turn base metals into gold, to discover the elixir of eternal life, to unlock the divine mysteries of creation itself, had gradually twisted into something far more sinister. The learned men of medieval Europe, driven by an insatiable hunger for forbidden knowledge, had crossed lines that should never have been crossed, opening doorways to realms that were meant to remain sealed. For centuries, alchemists had toiled in hidden chambers beneath cathedrals and castles, their furnaces glowing through the night as they sought to perfect the great work. They spoke in riddles and symbols, hiding their true intentions behind layers of mystical language and cryptic diagrams. Lead into gold, they claimed. Mercury and sulfur, they whispered. The philosopher's stone, they promised. But these were merely the surface manifestations of a deeper, more dangerous ambition. The desire to become as gods themselves, to command the very forces of life and death. The corruption began subtly, as corruption always does. A learned monk here, seeking to extend his life so he might better serve God. A court physician there, attempting to heal a dying king through unconventional means. Noble intentions, they told themselves. Sacred purposes. But pride, that most ancient of sins, had a way of warping even the purest motivations. As their experiments grew more complex, and their hunger for results more desperate, these alchemists began to experiment with forces beyond their understanding. Brother Marcus paused in his writing, his hand trembling as he recalled the events he had witnessed in the sealed chamber beneath the monastery. The abbot had sworn him to secrecy, but the images haunted his dreams. The writhing homunculus in its glass vessel, its tiny, malformed hands clawing at the sides as it mouthed silent screams. The soul stone that pulsed with an unholy light, containing the essence of a village girl, who had vanished 3 winters past. The dimensional rift that had opened during their final experiment, through which things that should not exist had begun to crawl. The pursuit of the Philosopher's Stone had become something else entirely. No longer content with transmuting metals, the alchemists had turned their attention to transmuting life itself. They sought to create artificial beings, to trap souls in crystalline prisons, to extend their own lives indefinitely by consuming the life force of others. They had delved into necromancy, demonology, and arts so dark that even speaking their names was said to invite damnation. In their hidden laboratories, these corrupted scholars had begun summoning entities from beyond the veil of reality. They called them angels of knowledge, claiming divine sanction for their work. But the creatures that answered their calls were no angels. They were beings of cosmic horror, entities that existed in dimensions where the laws of physics and morality held no sway. These entities whispered secrets to their human servants, teaching them how to rend the fabric of reality itself, how to create abominations that defied the natural order. The alchemists' workshops became charnel houses, where the boundaries between life and death, human and monster, sacred and profane were obliterated. They created chimeras by fusing human souls with animal bodies. They bred homunculi in alchemical wombs, tiny artificial humans that possessed fragments of stolen consciousness. They learned to extract and manipulate the very essence of life, condensing decades of human experience into glowing crystalline forms that could be consumed like wine. Brother Marcus dipped his quill again, the ink seeming to flow like blood across the parchment as he documented the true extent of their crimes. The abbot himself had become something no longer entirely human, his body sustained by the consumed life force of dozens of victims. His eyes had taken on the multifaceted appearance of an insect's, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple beings speaking in unison. The other monks had either fled in terror or been transformed into shambling servants, their souls replaced with fragments of the cosmic entities that had answered their master's summons. The corruption had spread beyond the monastery walls. Other centers of learning throughout Europe had fallen to similar temptations. Universities that had once been bastions of enlightenment became breeding grounds for horrors beyond imagination. Royal courts welcomed alchemists who promised immortality and unlimited power, not knowing that these scholars had already sold their humanity for forbidden knowledge. The very foundations of medieval civilization were being undermined by this spreading cancer of cosmic corruption. The entities that the alchemists served had their own agenda, the complete transformation of human reality into something more suitable for their own existence. They whispered of great workings that would reshape the fundamental nature of the physical world, turning it into a realm where their impossible geometries and alien physics would hold sway. The human race would be preserved, they promised, but only as raw material for their experiments, as vessels for their consciousness, as fuel for their incomprehensible designs. As Brother Marcus wrote, he could hear the sounds echoing from the chamber below, the bubbling of alchemical retorts, the chanting in languages that predated human civilization, the screams of the latest test subjects being processed into component parts for the great work. The monastery had become a factory for producing abominations, a workshop where the fundamental building blocks of reality were being rearranged according to the whims of entities that existed beyond the boundaries of sanity. The true horror was not just what the alchemists had become, but what they were creating. They had learned to weave human consciousness into crystalline matrices, creating soul stones that contained the compressed experiences and memories of their victims. These stones could be combined and manipulated, allowing the alchemists to craft artificial beings with predetermined personalities and knowledge. They had become gods of a sort, but gods of a nightmare realm where free will was an illusion and human dignity was merely another resource to be harvested and refined. The ripple effects of their work were already beginning to manifest across the European continent. Dimensional instabilities caused by their experiments were creating zones where the laws of nature functioned differently. Villagers near alchemical laboratories reported strange phenomena. Gravity flowing upward, time moving in circles, children born with memories of lives they had never lived. Forests withered and died as the life force was drained from them to fuel the alchemists' experiments. Rivers ran black with the runoff from their workshops, carrying dissolved fragments of human souls downstream to poison entire watersheds. Brother Marcus set down his quill and stared at the pages before him. He had documented the truth, but who would believe such a tale? And even if they did, what could be done to stop what had already been set in motion? The cosmic entities that the alchemists served existed outside of time and space, as humans understood them. They had been planning this corruption for eons, waiting for the moment when human knowledge would advance enough to serve their purposes. The greatest tragedy was that it all began with such noble intentions. The alchemists had genuinely sought to improve the human condition, to unlock the secrets of creation in service of their fellow man. But pride and ambition had corrupted their mission, and their pursuit of forbidden knowledge had opened doorways that could never be closed. They had sought to become like gods, and in doing so, they had invited entities that were gods, but gods of chaos and horror, beings whose very existence was antithetical to human life and sanity. The medieval world stood on the brink of a transformation that would make the Black Death seem like a minor inconvenience. The alchemist's great work was nearing completion, and when it was finished, humanity would face a choice: serve as willing vessels for the cosmic entities that their learned men had summoned, or be processed into raw materials for the construction of a new reality, where human concepts of morality, beauty, and love would have no meaning. Brother Marcus closed his journal and sealed it with wax, pressing his ring into the soft material to create an official seal. Perhaps future generations would discover his account and understand the true nature of the catastrophe that had befallen their world. Perhaps they would learn from the mistakes of the medieval alchemists and choose a different path. Or perhaps they too would be seduced by the promise of forbidden knowledge and repeat the same terrible errors. The shadows grew longer as night approached, and from the chamber below came the sound of something vast and inhuman stirring to life. The great work was accelerating, and Brother Marcus knew that his time, and perhaps humanity's time, was running short. Looking at the evidence of widespread alchemical corruption and the mounting threat of cosmic entities, the consequences of medieval alchemy's dark turn began to manifest in ways that would terrorize Europe for centuries to come. The dimensional barriers that practitioners had so recklessly weakened started to fail catastrophically, allowing malevolent forces to seep into our reality like poison through cracked stone. Villages across the continent reported increasingly disturbing phenomena. Livestock would be found arranged in perfect geometric patterns, their bodies unmarked but completely drained of blood. Children spoke of whispered voices calling to them from wells and cellars, speaking in languages that predated human speech. The very air in certain regions became thick and oppressive, carrying scents of sulfur and decay that had no earthly source. The most alarming development was the emergence of what medieval chroniclers termed the Hollow Men, individuals who appeared normal, but whose eyes held no spark of human consciousness. These beings walked among the living, perfectly mimicking human behavior while serving as vessels for otherworldly intelligences. They infiltrated courts, monasteries, and guilds, spreading their influence like a spiritual plague. Parish priests began reporting confessions that defied comprehension. Penitents described dreams of vast cities beneath the earth, populated by beings of living shadow, who promised knowledge beyond human understanding. Others spoke of finding themselves in places that couldn't exist, libraries with books written in flames, gardens where the flowers screamed, workshops where impossible machines crafted nightmares into reality. The alchemists themselves had become something far removed from their original scholarly pursuits. Those who survived their cosmic experiments were transformed into conduits for alien consciousness. They no longer sought to transmute base metals into gold, but rather to transmute reality itself into something more amenable to their otherworldly masters. Their laboratories became nodes of corruption, anchoring tiers in the fabric of existence that allowed increasingly powerful entities to manifest. Church authorities, finally grasping the magnitude of the threat, launched desperate campaigns to root out the alchemical corruption. But they found themselves fighting an enemy that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. How do you destroy a threat that exists partially outside of reality? How do you combat beings that can reshape the very laws of physics to their advantage? The Inquisition's efforts, while brutal, were often futile. For every alchemist they captured and burned, two more seemed to emerge from the shadows. The corruption had spread too far, taken root too deeply. Some investigators reported that certain alchemical texts seemed to rewrite themselves when not directly observed, their formulas shifting to accommodate whatever cosmic horror the reader was attempting to summon. Perhaps most terrifying was the discovery that the dimensional breaches were not random occurrences, but part of a coordinated invasion. The entities on the other side possessed intelligence vast and alien, and they had been planning their incursion for eons. Medieval alchemy had simply provided them with the tools they needed, human agents corrupted by forbidden knowledge and willing to serve as anchors for their reality-warping presence. The Cosmic Gateway project that had claimed so many lives was revealed to be merely the opening gambit in a much larger campaign. Each successful summoning, each soulstone created, each homunculus birthed, had weakened the barriers between worlds. The accumulated damage was approaching a critical threshold, beyond which the invasion would become unstoppable. As we examine these dark chapters of medieval history, we begin to understand that the alchemist's true legacy was not the advancement of natural philosophy or the pursuit of the philosopher's stone. Instead, they had opened doorways that should have remained forever sealed, inviting cosmic horrors into our world and fundamentally altering the nature of reality itself. Their reckless experiments had set in motion events that would echo through the centuries, leaving scars on the fabric of existence that persist to this day. The medieval period's end would not bring relief from these supernatural threats, but rather mark the beginning of a new phase in humanity's struggle against forces that sought to remake our world in their own incomprehensible image. The dark alchemical pursuits that had consumed medieval practitioners for centuries were finally approaching their most dangerous phase. These seekers, who had begun their journey with noble intentions of transmuting base metals and discovering the elixir of life, had long since abandoned any pretense of moral restraint. Their experiments had evolved beyond the physical realm, delving into territories that challenged the very foundations of reality itself. The convergence they had been working toward was no longer a distant possibility, but an imminent threat. Through decades of accumulated knowledge, forbidden rituals, and unholy alliances with entities from beyond the veil, the alchemists had developed the means to tear open permanent gateways between dimensions. These portals, unlike the temporary rifts they had created in their earlier experiments, would remain stable and allow for sustained contact with otherworldly beings. The most advanced practitioners had established communication networks that stretched across continents, sharing their discoveries through encrypted manuscripts and coded symbols that only the initiated could decipher. They spoke in hushed tones of the Great Working, a culminating ritual that would unite all their separate efforts into one massive undertaking. This would involve simultaneous ceremonies performed at key locations across Europe, each one designed to weaken the barriers between worlds at specific points where the fabric of reality was already thin. What made this convergence particularly terrifying was the level of preparation that had gone into it. The alchemists had spent generations mapping the ley lines and energy currents that flowed beneath the earth, identifying the precise locations where their intervention would have maximum effect. They had also cultivated relationships with corrupt nobles and church officials, ensuring that their activities would be protected and funded when the time came for their ultimate experiment. The entities they sought to summon were not random demons or spirits, but specific beings of immense power and intelligence that had been guiding their work from the beginning. These creatures existed in dimensions where the laws of physics operated differently, where matter and energy could be manipulated in ways that defied human understanding. The alchemists believed that by bringing these beings into the physical world, they could gain access to knowledge and abilities that would make them gods among mortals. But the price of such power was becoming increasingly clear to those who witnessed the preparations. The ritual sites chosen for the Great Working were already showing signs of corruption. The land itself seemed to recoil from what was being planned, with crops failing, animals fleeing, and strange phenomena manifesting in the surrounding areas. Local populations began to experience nightmares and visions, as if the approaching convergence was casting shadows backward through time. The alchemists themselves were changing as well. Those who had been involved in the planning for the longest periods showed signs of physical and mental transformation. Their bodies began to exhibit characteristics that suggested they were no longer entirely human. Some developed additional sensory organs that allowed them to perceive dimensions beyond normal sight. Others found that their thoughts were no longer entirely their own, as if they were sharing mental space with the entities they sought to summon. The written records from this period, though fragmentary and often encoded, reveal a growing sense of urgency among the practitioners. They knew that their window of opportunity was limited. The astronomical alignments they required occurred only rarely, and the next suitable configuration would not appear for several centuries. If they failed to complete the Great Working during this cycle, their accumulated efforts would be lost, and they would have to begin the process anew. More disturbing still were the reports of what happened to those who attempted to withdraw from the conspiracy as the convergence approached. Several alchemists who had second thoughts about the wisdom of their course found themselves unable to escape the network they had helped create. Some simply disappeared, leaving behind laboratories that showed signs of violent struggle. Others were found dead under circumstances that suggested they had been killed by forces beyond human understanding. The protective wards and safeguards that the alchemists had relied upon in their earlier experiments proved inadequate against the energies they were now channeling. Several ritual sites suffered catastrophic failures, with explosions of otherworldly force that left permanent scars on the landscape. These incidents served as grim reminders of what would happen if the Great Working went wrong on a larger scale. Yet despite these warning signs, the alchemists pressed forward with their plans. They had invested too much time, effort, and sacrifice to turn back now. The promise of ultimate knowledge and power drove them onward, even as the evidence mounted that they were dealing with forces far beyond their ability to control. They convinced themselves that their preparations were sufficient, that their understanding of the cosmic forces they were manipulating was complete enough to ensure success. The final phase of preparation involved the creation of vessels that could contain and direct the energies of the convergence. These were not simple containers, but complex constructs that combined alchemical science with architectural engineering and ritualistic symbolism. Each vessel was designed to serve as an anchor point for the otherworldly entities, allowing them to maintain a stable presence in the physical dimension once the portals were opened. The construction of these vessels required materials that could only be obtained through the most extreme measures. Human remains were needed, but not just any remains. The alchemists sought out individuals who had died under specific circumstances, whose life force had been shaped by particular experiences of suffering or transcendence. They raided graveyards and battlefields, but also arranged for certain deaths to occur according to their specifications. The psychological toll of these activities was evident in the increasingly erratic behavior of the practitioners. Many began to exhibit symptoms of what modern psychology would recognize as severe mental illness, but which they interpreted as signs of their growing connection to cosmic forces. They spoke of receiving direct communications from their otherworldly allies, of being granted visions of the transformed world that would emerge after the convergence. The mundane world around them began to take notice of their activities as well. Strange lights appeared in the sky above their laboratories. Unexplained sounds echoed from their underground chambers. Local authorities found themselves dealing with reports of missing persons and disturbing discoveries that they could not adequately explain or investigate. The church, despite its corruption in some quarters, began to mobilize resources to investigate what it correctly perceived as a threat to the established order. But the alchemists had anticipated resistance and had taken steps to neutralize it. Their network included agents in positions of authority who could misdirect investigations and suppress evidence. They had also developed weapons and defenses based on their otherworldly knowledge, capabilities that gave them significant advantages over conventional forces. Several attempts to raid their facilities ended in disaster for the attackers, with survivors reporting encounters that challenged their understanding of reality. As the time for the Great Working approached, the alchemists began to gather at the primary ritual site, a location chosen for its unique geological and mystical properties. This convergence of practitioners from across Europe represented the culmination of centuries of planning and preparation. They brought with them the accumulated knowledge of their tradition, along with the materials and instruments needed for the ultimate ceremony. The site itself had been transformed over the years into something that barely resembled a natural landscape. Geometric patterns had been carved into the earth and filled with substances that glowed with their own inner light. Structures had been erected that seemed to bend space around them, creating optical illusions that made it difficult for observers to determine their actual size or shape. The very air in the area seemed charged with potential energy, crackling with forces that made conventional measurement impossible. Yet, even as they prepared for their moment of triumph, some among the alchemists began to question whether they had truly understood what they were unleashing. The entities they had been communicating with had grown more demanding in their requirements, asking for sacrifices and commitments that went beyond what had originally been agreed upon. There were signs that these beings had their own agenda, one that might not align with the alchemists' goals of gaining power and knowledge. The convergence they had worked so hard to achieve was no longer entirely under their control. The forces they had set in motion had gained a momentum of their own, drawing energy from sources the alchemists had not anticipated. The ritual they had planned was beginning to execute itself, with or without their conscious direction. They found themselves swept along by currents of cosmic force that they could influence but not truly command. And in the darkness beyond the veil, ancient intelligences that had waited eons for this opportunity began to stir, preparing to cross the threshold into a reality they intended to remake according to their own alien designs. As we've seen throughout our journey into medieval alchemy's dark legacy, the corruption and dimensional breaches unleashed by these forbidden practitioners left scars that would endure far beyond the Middle Ages. But the true horror lies not in what was lost, but in what remains hidden, waiting in the shadows of our modern world. For the alchemical networks that survived the great purges of the 15th century did not simply vanish into obscurity. They adapted, evolved, and went deeper underground. The Brotherhood of the Crimson Veil, the Order of the Obsidian Crucible, and dozens of smaller covens scattered across Europe, carrying with them fragments of the most dangerous knowledge ever conceived. These survivors understood that their work had grown too powerful, too visible. The dimensional tiers they had opened, the entities they had summoned, the very fabric of reality they had torn. All of this demanded a more subtle approach. In the abandoned monasteries of remote mountain valleys, in the forgotten cellars beneath ancient universities, in the sealed chambers of noble houses, whose bloodlines stretched back to the original practitioners, the work continued. But now it was cloaked in new forms. What had once been crude transmutation circles carved into stone floors became intricate geometric patterns woven into tapestries and architectural designs. The symbols that had adorned laboratory walls were incorporated into family crests, religious iconography, and guild marks. The knowledge lived on, encoded and hidden in plain sight. The practitioners themselves adopted new identities. No longer the wild-eyed hermits working alone in isolated towers, they became respected scholars, influential merchants, even high-ranking church officials. They learned to speak in code, to communicate through seemingly innocent academic correspondence, to conduct their most dangerous experiments under the cover of legitimate research. The University of Prague, the libraries of Venice, the workshops of skilled artisans, all became unwitting hosts to cells of alchemical conspirators who met in shadow and spoke in whispers of the great work that must continue. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how they began to recruit. Where once alchemical knowledge had been jealously guarded by individual masters, the survivors realized that their ultimate goals required a broader base of support. They began to identify promising students, young minds hungry for forbidden knowledge, individuals whose ambition or desperation made them susceptible to the dark promises of transmutation and power. These recruits were brought in slowly, their education carefully managed, their loyalty tested through increasingly dangerous assignments. The initiation rituals became more sophisticated, more psychologically devastating. New members were required to participate in ceremonies that would bind them irrevocably to the cause. They witnessed the summoning of entities from beyond the dimensional barriers, participated in the sacrifice of both animal and human subjects, and were forced to ingest alchemical compounds that altered their very perception of reality. Those who survived these ordeals emerged changed, their minds partially open to the alien geometries and impossible mathematics that underpinned the alchemists' work. As decades passed, these hidden networks began to establish what they called the Eternal Archive, a distributed collection of the most dangerous alchemical knowledge, copied and recopied, hidden in dozens of locations across the continent. Unlike the crude grimoires of earlier practitioners, these texts were works of art, illuminated manuscripts that appeared to be religious texts or classical treatises to the uninitiated eye. But to those who knew the proper ciphers and codes, they contained detailed instructions for opening dimensional portals, formulae for creating homunculi with enhanced intelligence and supernatural abilities, and most terrifying of all, the theoretical framework for what the alchemists called the final synthesis. The final synthesis represented the ultimate goal of their centuries of research, nothing less than the complete transformation of human consciousness and physical reality. Where earlier alchemists had sought merely to transmute base metals into gold or create the elixir of life, these hidden masters understood that such goals were merely stepping stones to something far grander. They envisioned a world where the barriers between dimensions were permanently dissolved, where human minds could directly interface with the cosmic entities they had contacted, where the very laws of physics could be rewritten through alchemical manipulation. But this grand vision required more than just scientific knowledge. It demanded a fundamental reshaping of human society itself. the hidden alchemists began to work toward positions of influence, using their supernatural insights and otherworldly allies to accumulate wealth, political power, and social control. They infiltrated royal courts, manipulated trade routes, and even influenced the course of wars and plagues to create the conditions they believed were necessary for their ultimate triumph. The Renaissance, that great flowering of human knowledge and artistic achievement, was shaped in ways that historians have never suspected by these shadowy figures. The patronage that funded great works of art and scientific discovery often came with strings attached, subtle requirements that certain symbols be included, certain geometric principles be followed, certain locations be chosen for their proximity to dimensional weak points. The greatest minds of the age, from Leonardo da Vinci to Galileo Galilei, found themselves unknowingly participating in experiments whose true purpose remained hidden even from them. Meanwhile, the dimensional damage inflicted by centuries of alchemical experimentation continued to spread. The entities that had been summoned in medieval laboratories did not simply return to their home dimensions when the portals closed. Many remained, existing in the spaces between realities, slowly working to widen the cracks through which they had originally emerged. Strange phenomena began to manifest across Europe with increasing frequency. Towns where shadows moved independently of their casters, forests where travelers reported encountering impossible creatures, ancient buildings where the very architecture seemed to shift when no one was looking directly at it. The Church, despite its official condemnation of alchemical practices, found itself increasingly infiltrated by practitioners who had learned to disguise their work as legitimate theological study. Certain monasteries became centers of hybrid research, where mystical Christian practices were combined with alchemical techniques to create new forms of dimensional manipulation. The Inquisition, established to root out heresy, often found itself chasing shadows, while the real threats operated from within its own ranks. By the dawn of the modern era, the descendants and spiritual heirs of medieval alchemy had evolved into something far more dangerous than their predecessors could have imagined. They had learned patience, subtlety, and the power of working through existing institutions rather than against them. The crude laboratories and obvious symbols of earlier practitioners had given way to a vast, hidden infrastructure of knowledge and influence that spanned continents. And perhaps, most chilling of all, they had learned to think in terms of centuries rather than years. The final synthesis, they believed, was not something to be achieved in a single generation, but rather the culmination of a multi-generational project that would ultimately reshape reality itself. Each generation of practitioners was tasked not with completing the work, but with advancing it one crucial step forward, preparing the ground for their successors to build upon. The dark truth behind medieval alchemy, then, is not simply that it was a failed pseudoscience or a collection of dangerous, but ultimately limited practices. It was the beginning of something far more ambitious and terrifying, a centuries-long conspiracy to fundamentally alter the nature of human existence and physical reality. The symbols carved into laboratory walls, the entities summoned from other dimensions, the homunculi created in glass wombs, the dimensional tears that scarred the landscape. All of these were merely the early stages of a project that continues to this day, hidden behind facades of respectability and legitimacy, working toward goals that would have been incomprehensible to the crude alchemists who first opened the forbidden doors. The practitioners of today, working in research facilities and universities, in government laboratories and corporate think tanks, in the highest levels of finance and politics, carry forward the same fundamental ambition that drove their medieval predecessors. They seek nothing less than the complete transcendence of human limitations through the manipulation of forces that exist beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. And unlike their ancestors, who worked in isolation and ignorance, They possess the accumulated knowledge of centuries, the resources of modern technology, and the patience born of absolute certainty in their ultimate success. The dark truth behind medieval alchemy is that it never truly ended. Looking at this YouTube video script about medieval alchemy, I can craft a powerful concluding paragraph that maintains the dramatic tone and mysterious atmosphere established throughout. Here's a compelling conclusion. So as we pull back the veil on medieval alchemy's darkest secrets, we're left with a chilling truth that echoes through the centuries. These weren't just eccentric scholars pursuing impossible dreams, but desperate souls who danced with forces beyond their comprehension, leaving behind a legacy written in blood, madness, and whispered warnings. The alchemists may have failed to transmute lead into gold, but they succeeded in transforming themselves into cautionary tales that still haunt the shadows of history. Perhaps some knowledge was never meant to be pursued, and some doors should remain forever sealed.